I'm not a prognosticator. I can't tell you what's going to be big, except for the fact that whatever you learn, you're going to have to learn something else after it. And that's the only thing that we know is going to be true in your career.
Welcome to That Pivotal Moment of Change, the podcast where we dive into the career-defining moments that shape who we become. Success, setbacks, big decisions, we unpack it all. Let's get into it. On today's episode, we're speaking with Kip Voytek.
Hey, Kip, welcome to the podcast. Looking forward to talking with you today.
Ryan, it's good to see you. It's been a while, and thanks for having me. I've been enjoying it so far, so thank you. This has been fun already.
I'm looking forward to digging in. So let's get started here. So first, I'm going to start with, can you talk a little bit about your background and what you are up to today?
I am currently doing a combination of, I'm a little bit more in the solopreneur mode. So I'm doing a combination of deep data work for clients. I am still doing some design stuff, but I'm mostly doing what I've been calling like digital business design and digital business strategy, which is, do you want to use connected technologies to advance the mission of your organization? And I feel like that's on a continuum from my background as a designer from the years before I met you and then when we were working together. And then I'll just pause for a second and just sort of highlight that I came into design and digital as a second career after a good decade of working as a political consultant and a speechwriter and kind of a policy wonk and activist. So there was a shift over from that. So that was sort of the background. But let me stop there and see where you want to take that question, because I know there could be interesting places to go or places to avoid.
So how do you think, starting off not in the design space and more in the political world, how do you think that has helped you with where you are today?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because it does come up sometimes, because a lot of my time was spent as a union organizer. I was like out in Heartland or Flyover America, depending on what you want to call it these days. But I think the through line had been, I'm going to step back a second. I don't like to say this because it makes me seem old, but there's no point in pretending I'm not old. I went to college with a typewriter and I graduated with a computer. And that's a very narrow window for a lot of people. And I think one of the things that happened in there was I was just fascinated with those very early computers, what I might be able to force them to do. And I had actually started a student newspaper using Print Shop, this ancient piece of software. And it was like X-Acto knives and Xerox machines and tape, but getting the images from that and doing the layout like that. And that kind of like started me in a path of thinking about design, because I was like laying things out and had to think about it. Design in the very classic visual sense. I also just loved finding ways to make computers do things that might be useful even when they weren't powerful. So I had that technology piece. And then I think the biggest through line, though, is communication. That most political work was, I was a congressional staffer. I would read 2 boxes of papers, 2 big banker boxes of papers, and then I would write a 2-page memo, and then I would write a speech, or then I would write a pamphlet, and then I would do a design, and then I would do an infographic. And I think all of that kind of had that through line of communications, making technology, using technology in a way that empowered people that had something they wanted to say, or a movement they wanted to build, or a coalition they wanted to build. And just that enjoyment, because I think, if you do that typewriter computer thing, you could do it grudgingly, or you could do it with like, wow, this could be really interesting and what else I could do. And I think I've always been able to maintain that attitude, and that allowed me to, when I got burnt out on political work, I got into game design. And when game design dried up on the East Coast, I got into web design, and that's eventually where I met you.
How did game design happen in conjunction with the political side?
I mean, I got lucky. There are 2 places that, I just have to acknowledge being lucky. I had some friends from high school and college who had started a game company, and one of them moved to New York right when I was getting just totally burnt out. I was just like always traveling, always sick, always struggling for money. I used to like write database programs and program database software on the side to pay the bills when I was working on a hopeless cause. And when I got burnt out, he was like, come up to do games. Like, I really like that stuff. And it's funny too, because my friend hated games, but he had this job. So you're so lucky. Like, I love this thing. Like, pull me in. So I just started out at the ground level, like about 25 years ago. And I was like doing QA. I was designing levels. And then I eventually got into writing the stories and then designing the gameplay. And because 3D games had stressed the computers of that time so much, I had to learn a lot about technology to see how much you could get out of these, Pentium computers to create a really rich, robust thing that wouldn't crash or work within the resources. But I got lucky because I loved playing games. I was fascinated by the educational and creative potential of them. And then I had a friend who was able to get me in at the ground floor, and then I just had to scratch and claw after that.
Sounds like there's a good dose also of curiosity there, seeing new things and wondering what they could become. And I even remember back when, probably around the time when we worked together, I remember working on an account with mobile devices and clamshell phones and up, down, left, right with OK in the middle. And at the time, that was pretty innovative and sophisticated. And just remember thinking about that at the time, where could this all go? And what is this going to be? I never imagined probably nearly where we've ended up.
That's 100% thing. And I think I remember we used to have that lab effort, or maybe it was Future Vision or something. I mean, I forget what it was
Oh,
called.
yeah, Future Vision. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it was started by our friend Richard. But it was one of those things of like, what was cool about it, on your point about the curiosity, was like, and this was the thing that was great about the corporate culture that we were all in, was that we could look at something and say, huh, I wonder what you can do with that. Isaac Asimov has that great line where it's like, invention doesn't happen when someone says eureka. Invention happens when someone looks at something and says, huh, that's funny. Like that thing of like, just it tickles a nerve ending and you think there's some potential there. And then some of them are long games. I mean, it's kind of funny because you and I were there when we were like pitching QR codes all the time. This is the year of QR codes. And it just never happened. And now they're just kind of like very matter of fact because people say, oh, I think I can do something useful with that. So I think that curiosity piece of just like, I can't see immediately the value. And I think this is something that differentiated generations too, because, you could tell it's like, hey, I'm going to be generational for saying, hey, boomer, check this out. Yeah, so what? Like, okay, you don't get it. We're supposed to start talking now about what we can do with it, not how we can plug it into your existing work. So yeah, that curiosity piece I think is absolutely essential.
Definitely. And could you talk a little bit more just about some of the work you're doing today?
I think there are sort of three themes that are sort of continuous with the work that I've done. I got very, very active in data when I was working at a public corporation. We were trying to figure out, as a holding company, trying to figure out what's our data play. And this was about 10 years ago. And I really stayed actively involved in it. I mean, I got into it because I had the technical chops to do database work. I also, liked and knew and had done a lot of stuff with data. So I do a fair amount. And a lot of this is with the World Bank Group, certain groups that are doing like projects in West and East Africa, just getting data, cleaning it, trying to see what information we can get out of it, finding ways to integrate them. And I highlight that one because I think that's a huge part of digital work today that also informs design work. There's so much data that's out there being collected. And even though we've been hyping data for 10 years, we still aren't using first party data well. And a lot of people just aren't collecting it as well as they could, and they don't know how to integrate it. And as designers, with the kind of stuff that you and I work on, you need that data either just for feedback or it's the blood that's sort of flowing through the thing. So there's a lot of data collection, and that's the other part on the design side. There's doing a lot of data collection and analysis through handsets. And sometimes this is like in villages that are barely electrified. Sometimes it's in urban centers that have very wavering levels of connectivity, or the prices are very high. And so it's a really interesting design challenge there to work with people who, and maybe we can come back to that, who use phones on a regular basis, but we might not consider them to have the high levels of literacy that we might for enterprise software. And then the last one I think that I would just throw in there is, and I've been calling it digital business design. I've been hesitant about that phrase, digital transformation, because not everyone wants to transform. Sometimes people just want to create a business unit that's digital, or they want to enhance a business unit through digital, and they need to bring some design thinking to it. And transformation's just kind of lofty and a little bit overused. And so I do some consulting on that with a variety of different kinds of clients. Some that just, sometimes it's as straightforward as an e-commerce piece. We just want to expand our D2C, and that, we all experience that acceleration of D2C stuff during the pandemic. But other times it's also like, We're in the business of talking to people about the category. We're in the business of coaching people in some particular way. We have an advisor piece, and there are different ways of adding value. And so that's probably the place that that in the data place I'm most interested in, although I still get a lot involved, a fair amount in the design of applications.
I really like the way you frame digital business design.
Yeah, that word is I struggle with words, and sometimes it's to my own detriment because it's just like, that's just not right. And sometimes I just have to say, you know what, we're all saying it's, I'll embrace it. But there is something there of like that thing, we're designing a business unit, and that gets us into P&L conversations, which I think is a design conversation. That gets us into operations that we should think about. And I'm sorry, I think you had something to say, but I'll just finish this part out. One of the things where we were, because I think we stopped working together around 2007, we were at a place where we were starting to graduate from, hey, we need a website that does this, to we want to get better at digital. And but then we needed to start to see ourselves as consultants and business partners, not just people who could design on this medium that they didn't really understand how to do. And that was like I think that's one of the big shifts that happened with a lot of agencies, that some of them just sort of say, yeah, we'll bang out some sites for you, versus we're going to be partners as you evolve your business in through the changing digital landscape.
I actually love that. And I think we could probably riff on this one for a long time. I want to pick your brain. So I'm going to move on here. Moving back to some reflective questions. What are some key lessons you have learned throughout your career?
So I think the most important one for me, and you picked up on this, or you opened up that area, is curiosity. I think there's a mindset. We need a more flexible mindset in digital. And let me approach it in two ways, hopefully without making it too long. There's a guy, Roger Martin, who was the dean of the Rotman School of Business, and I think he started to get big after 2010. But he's really interesting, and one of the things that he was talking about digital change and what's going to happen to your business, is he talked about the difference between reliability and validity. And the thing that was really great about that is, like, there's no reliable way to know what your digital play should be in business. All you have are valid hypotheses. And I think he was dealing with a whole generation of managers that wanted to be able to reliably make a decision. Kip, if we do this, are we going to get 10% lift? And the only honest thing to say is we don't know, because no one has done this before. We don't have baselines to measure this against, and it's not medicine. But we do have validity. And I think that ties into the curiosity piece, that you just have to constantly be questioning your assumptions, being open to something new. Our old boss, Bob Greenberg, I mean, one of the things that was just wonderful about him is, like, you would walk into your office and see some little device on your desk. You'd be like, oh, what's that? And that was a guy who's like fabulously wealthy, right? I mean, tens of millions of dollars. I think I had a barcode scanner for a digital library thing. And he's like, oh, what do you do with that? And I said, well, you can scan all these books and then you have a catalog. It's like, that's amazing. You're going to show it to the client meeting this afternoon. It's at 3:00. Like, that kind of openness. And the other piece I would throw in with that is, it's a bit of a skill too, because you have to manage where you put your attention. So you can't be open to everything, but you have to have a set of filters and questions to sort of trust your judgment that this is worth spending time on and that this is worth pursuing. The other two lessons that I would just sort of throw in there would be, I think digital for me is a team sport. I don't think there's an auteur thing, even with like games that are associated with people, which are probably the most complicated digital things still. You have to know how to work cross-discipline, and you have to have this cognitive empathy. I'm a designer. I need to understand the technologist mindset. I'm a technologist. I need to understand the business person's mindset. There's just no way it can be. And that sort of fits in with the agile piece too. It's like, part of the reason waterfall doesn't work is because you need to be active at every moment. You need to be collaborating at every moment. I had two others that I wrote down. I'll just throw them out there and see if you want to go with them. One, I think I'm continually surprised at how tech illiterate we remain. That there are just some clients you go in and we just don't have the time to bring them up to speed on the technologies that we've been looking at, or to recognize that there are different management patterns with that. And I just think on that tech piece also, I think even when you and I were talking, I was like, if I have two candidates who are equally good and one of them knows tech a little bit better than the other one, I'm going to pick the person who knows tech. Because and I know some people that are someone who should be a guest. I'll recommend him later, but you just can't separate the two. We're not in a place where you can be an effective designer and separate those pieces. You got to know what's happening at the back end, and so much of your design decisions have to be affected by the underlying data structure, the flow of information, and the services beneath the tip of the iceberg. So those are my three big things.
Those are great. Completely agree with what you're saying on the tech literacy piece of it.
Yeah, I think, well, that was probably more like working with you. There's just like, you can't go in there. Anytime I would hear someone say, oh, we'll let the programmers figure that, it's like, nope, nope, you're giving up a huge part of the experience to someone whose job it is not to think about the experience. And you can't do that. You got to own it all.
100% true. Okay. So what are some of the bigger challenges you faced in your career, and how did you overcome those challenges?
So I knew you were going to ask this. And I tried to do some soul searching with some character flaws to fix, and I just couldn't find, I just couldn't find anything. No, I did seriously think about this, and I think there are two big things that came up for me, and I think they're kind of relevant to people who work in the spaces that you and I are in or adjacent to. The first one, and this one has become more of a challenge as I've gotten older, is learning how to learn. There's a new thing coming down the pike. Let's say for AI, AI is coming down the pike 2 years ago. I can get on the hype machine. AI is hallucinating and get all freaked out. And some clients like to hear that. And some people like to hear those kind of stories. Or I can dig in and sort of learn, okay, this is basically a very, very, very useful recombination of existing information that can help speed up a lot of things. This can help me with case law for if I'm in a law office. This can help me look at x-rays. And those are things that are absolutely amazing to embrace. But if we get too hysterical about this, and we listen to the tech columnists at the New York Times saying, suddenly the AI was flirting with me. I think this is where you have to learn how to learn the right things. Like, you got to get past the hype phase, and you have to get into some first principles and mental models of how this stuff works in order to make good judgments. And a lot of people, when we would talk about the learn to code kind of thing, people are like, I don't have to learn how to be a Java developer. It's like, no, that's true. You don't, because we're going to hire those. But you need to understand their job and their cognitive mental models well enough to be able to work with them effectively, manage them, help them get out of the weeds. So learning to learn was the first one. And then the other one's a little personal to me, is that I sort of made my bones and got on an accelerated path being a firefighter. There was something that was broken, and because I was good at tech and also good at design, and some people would say I wasn't very good at design because I was always a firefighter coming in making quick, easy decisions or fast decisions. But the shift from putting out fires and solving problems to having that open space as a creative director was a real difficult shift for me, or not a difficult shift, but I had to recognize the moment, because I was so used to, like, something's broken, Voytek can fix it. They're going to be happy I fixed it. I might get a promotion based on that. But then when I had the open space, I had to operate differently. And I think that's more relevant than just a personal one for me, because I think a lot of people are dealing with like legacy systems. Do we fix this thing? Do we just get to do we just lurch forward a little bit and kick the can down the road, or do we try to address things at a deeper level? And I think in some ways, a lot of people that are in legacy companies are constantly, or companies with legacy technology are constantly juggling that balance. And so that was a big one to sort of learn. And the biggest thing in terms of how I did it was just like identifying it, recognizing, okay, Kip, get out of firefighter mode. You actually have some time, and you have some people that can think about it. Don't rush them through the process, but just to identify and be aware of it.
Yeah, that's great. And you always were, I remember, very good at that piece of it, at the firefighting piece of it.
I don't know that I made the shift very well in front of you. So I think I was usually like, okay, I got to fix it. Everyone shut up. We're going to fix this.
Well, one of the interesting things I think about design, and I would suspect this is true in a lot of different careers, is what I'm starting to see is the longer you do it, I feel like at some point it just kind of trails off. Like, I don't know if I'm a good designer anymore because I don't spend that much time designing, and I've been around it now for 20 plus years, because you get to a point where you do become a firefighter. You're dealing with problems and kind of higher level pieces that prevent you from actually doing the work itself. You get good at looking at it and maybe talking about it.
That's actually a really good point. I'm curious if you've had this, because I've been in some where it's like, okay, I want to get my hands dirty again. And a friend was like, when he was like moved from being a department head back to being a client lead, And he was like writing S&W. It's like, it's kind of like chopping wood, like, enjoying that. But there's also that level of like, okay, what have I missed in that period? The only reason I'm designing is because no one else is doing it right now. But then also, and that's sort of where that curiosity balance comes in too, because it's really easy to fall back on old habits. Or even as you're learning a new tool, to use the old paradigms from the old tool as you use the new tool, and then use all the old design paradigms, or just rely on what's like, subconsciously gotten into your brain. So it's a really interesting challenge. I mean, I imagine you do what I do with you, which is I counted on you and other people that, I know are thinking the same people. Like, tell me what I'm missing. But what do you, is that how you deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, that's in large part how I deal with it. Sometimes I'll have an idea and like, let me do it. Let me execute on that idea. We've started using Figma and auto layouts in Figma, which I just haven't quite learned yet. So what I've realized is when I try to go in and do something in Figma and I know exactly what I want it to look like, I can't get it to look that way myself, but other people are really good at getting it to look that way and bringing a lot more to the idea that makes it better than what I initially had in my mind. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. Oh, no, I like that too. And that last 2%, I mean, that's where craft really comes in. But it's funny too, because some of these tools have things that you and I would have killed for. Like the first time I did wireframes, when I was doing games was like, like 99, since I'm admitting age. And I used PowerPoint, because that was the only drawing tool that I had. And I didn't want to like lay out, $800 for Illustrator. And now, and then the whole thing there was like, is there a way I can make it so I can just click instead of having to page back and forth? And now, like, we've got all the things that you and I would have dreamt of. Like, oh my god, how can we make this happen? But there is a challenge there, because it also does things that we don't want it to do, and sometimes things happen. Like, what the freak is that all about?
I mean, it's come so far now where, and this could be a whole other rabbit hole, but talking about wireframes, I grew up in the design world doing wireframes and working as a visual designer. I haven't seen wireframe in years. Because now we're working with polished, we have libraries and we have polished design systems. If you need to design something, it's almost hard not to go high fidelity.
That's interesting, because I've been in places where most of the stuff I'm doing does not have an existing known design system. Like, they don't have a known color palette, or they don't have the other piece. Now, this is sort of in the World Bank work. So like, there's an application where people are going into villages and, managing these months long planning processes and recording the actions and the activities. And there's a level where I've been very hesitant, to commit. It's like, look, I want to do low res sketches, and I don't want to spend a lot of time getting the colors in, right, or anything, because we still don't know the overall flow. We still don't know how much information we should be collecting. And what we're testing now with the designs is it usable on an Android handset? Now, at a place where you're an internal person, you probably can go much faster with that, because you do have the libraries, you do know the colors. The bigger risk is not looking like what you're used to than it is looking too much like you're used to, because that was the big thing that we had at the beginning. It's like, we want people to focus on the function and the flow, and we don't want to let them get lost in the visuals. And we also honestly don't want people to sort of skate by in a meeting and just focus on the visuals, or the colors, because then they're not addressing the real thing. Like, there is a way of managing focus, but it's a real challenge. And I have had people say, Kip, that's really old school. It's like, well, maybe, is it? Like, but I don't want to. I don't want us talking about colors. So I did the old thing. I don't know if you remember, like, that Bill Buxton book that had some currency for a while, but I did the old thing of like using the raw lines and the edges that didn't connect. So it was very clear that this is a draft. And so no one could say, I don't like the way, like, you didn't have to waste any of that time, because people's brains lock in like an optical illusion, and they're just at an altitude and they can't get out of it. All right, you scratched an itch there. That bugs me. So I went on a little long there. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay. That's another topic. I think there's a lot of different themes here that we could probably have follow up.
or story.
Well, yeah, or war stories for sure. But just the way design has evolved and changed, and has, even the role of a UX designer and a visual designer, and how that's all kind of morphed and changed. It's interesting. And back to the curiosity through line, and we'll talk about this actually in a little while, just the future of design, but it really does make you think about where we're heading.
Yeah, yeah, pulling in a lot of directions, and that's part of the joy of the work. I mean, I'll be honest, I had years where I was no longer excited by the internet, because it's just like, oh god. there's nothing interesting. And somehow in the last 3 or 4 years, and partly through the bank, it's like, oh, it's getting interesting again. I can scratch these itches because now I'm being challenged with new stuff.
So, can you share an instance where a setback or failure turned out to be a hidden opportunity?
Yeah. So I think this one was a little tricky because I mean, I think the idea of failure as an opportunity or failure as a learning thing. I think most of the examples I was able to come up with is I had learned something and I had learned about adapting. And so I think that sort of influenced the learn to learn, challenge your assumptions. Ray Dalio has this great quote where he says, whatever success I've had has come less from what I know and more about how I've managed around what I don't know. And I think that was a really interesting one. So I think, for these questions around pivotal moments, I'm just going to like talk about the Nike account. We had gotten this account that was absolutely transformational for the company, and they were the most demanding client. They were the most confident client to the point of like, it could be perceived as arrogance, except they were usually right in the stuff that they were telling us. And we just weren't getting stuff right. And we had to learn all sorts of new things, how to bang out concepts really, really fast, how to do more than like 3 rounds and get an approval. It's like, no, 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 you're going to keep giving us ideas until we get the right one. So we had to learn to like down-res our ideas. We had to learn how to communicate the essence of the ideas. And we also had to learn how to reorganize our work stream. We had to like distance ourselves from internal politics. At first everyone wanted to be part of the account because it was hot. Then it looked like when we were going to lose it, everyone was moving away from us, which actually turned out to be a relief because then we could actually just do the work and not have to, kiss butt. But the question that you're asking then is how did you get through that piece? And most of it came from people who are on the leadership team with me coming in and saying, I'm noticing this problem is getting in the way. What do you think we can do? And then we kick some ideas around. And then I kind of went out and, did the human shield thing and pissed everyone off to get it done. Hey, I have an idea for how we can force people to do something. Or I would sit down with people and say, okay, what do we do to avoid this problem? And that comes back to that team sport idea that they had most of the ideas. I might add the last 10 or 20%, and I'm almost certainly had to go out and just like fight for it and do the air cover and get them to not worry about it. And so I think that was like one of the biggest ones because we were on the brink of disaster. I mean, I was at the point of like telling people, it's like, look, just do good work. No one's going to fire you. You're on this account because you're good. And the best we can do is this. And, and even with Bob Greenberg, I remember saying, it's like, Bob, we're doing really good work. They may fire us, but we're doing really good work. And Bob's like, yeah, if we're doing good work, that's the best we can do. Then it's out of our hands. And that was really big for me. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that was one of those places where I think the biggest lesson was pull people in, get the ideas, let people know. This is also part of curiosity, right? Let people know that you want to hear ideas. And that your version of leadership isn't that I'm going to come in and you do this and you do this. It's like, I'm going to help you figure out what we should pay attention to. You're going to help me figure out what I should get you to pay attention to. And that's a very different kind of leadership than a lot of things that you'll see, especially in the creative director world.
I think there's also something interesting there about understanding what you can control and what you can't control. Like the conversation with Bob, and as long as we're doing good work, that's what you can control. And it's different than, well, much different conversations like the work's okay, or we've missed something you haven't. So it's like, I think there's just something really interesting there just about also, as simple as it sounds, understanding that if you know what you can control, those are the things that matter and that you should be focused on.
That's a really good way of putting it. I hadn't thought to do that, but I like that one because I think it also highlights too how to spend your energy. It's just like at some point, they hired you to do a job because they think you know how to do it. So if you're spending all your time second guessing yourself as you second guess them, you're trying to control things that you can't, and you're trying to respond to things that not only can't you control them, but you have an imperfect understanding of. That's a really good way of putting it, actually. Because at some point you just have to find the right audience. You have to find the ideal reader. You have to find the right client for you. And that's why there's so many agencies out there, because different people need different things, or that's why you have different types of personalities on the team that you've built. That's really good. I like that. Thank you.
Can you recall a moment in your career that significantly influenced your path?
Yeah, so certainly the Nike one was a part of that. But since we already talked about that, I think I'll hit the other one, which was I had gone to work at a public company. So it was about, I think at its maximum market capitalization, it was about a $2 billion company, which at the time was pretty substantial. and they were sort of an insurgent holding company. And that one was really interesting because it was starting to recognize, I think, two things. One, that digital work was getting deeper in a way that we weren't necessarily catching up on. So back in the early 2000s, were you an ITP guy?
I was.
Okay, okay. I was trying to remember before we come in. I thought that's what it was. Back when we were sort of like, all sort of like figuring out how to build skill sets around that, there was enough complexity and enough difficulty just to figure out how to get a site up that would run, to make it compelling, to make it fit into varying levels of bandwidth, and then also with different user levels. And then this last one, and I think this is where I started to move towards digital business design. That was pretty pivotal. And this might not be the kind of story you were looking for, but with some of this recognition, I was laying out a map of like, okay, what do digital activities look like? Because we're going to go out and buy some companies. And so I was trying to put out a map of like where we do our M&A work. And there was just this recognition that the table stakes were doing good design. There may or may not be a premium for excellent design on that surface interface level, but once you got below the iceberg, this is where you win. This is where the problems are hard to solve. This is where you're not in a race to the bottom on pricing. And these are where the next challenges are going to be, because now people are going to have to organize their organizations around these changes. They're going to have to get the data right. They're going to have to really test their assumptions. And that was a big one. And so that moved me a lot towards data. That moved me towards these newer design, like service design, and even just like, architectural thinking that we might normally have left to the tech person, but we have to sort of think about. And that was a pretty big one, because I think that was a shift. And I think we're still in the middle of that. How do we use the data? How do we design services? How do we think intelligently all the way below? The interface is the tip of the iceberg, right? And then you have all the business policies and processes and things that are happening, and learning that stuff. And that was a pretty big change point for me. That sort of moved me to start Rumble Fox, which I did for a while. And that sort of moved the kind of work that I'm doing now.
Makes a lot of sense. I love the iceberg analogy.
Yeah, it's one of my most overused slides, because there is that thing, of like, people look at Uber and they think, and you would see business journalists talking about the Uber app. It's like, it's not the app. There's like the fleet of cars, there's the regulations, there's the algorithms, there's so much there that bubbles up to it. And you have to be thinking, someone needs to be thinking about all that. I think that's what the maturation of the product management and product thinking is coming in, that we're starting to really get our arms around that in a way that, some places have been doing for decades. But, I think largely we're starting to get around that now.
Okay. So moving into some skill and insight related questions, what specific skills or mindsets have been crucial in navigating your career twists and turns?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to sound like a broken record, but I think it's a hard enough thing to do, and I'm actually struggling with it. I'll say it, which is lifelong learning. That And it's kind of interesting, because friends of mine who are doctors, lawyers, they sort of have ongoing professional education. Like they know that they have to get recertified, and there's something that pulls them along. We don't actually have that kind of structure yet, partly because we don't have a guild that certifies us. We don't have a bar association or medical licensing. But I think it's easy to lose. You have those reminders, and you have people who will set it up for you to tell you what you need to know. And I think that's been the biggest one. And the fact that for a while, and maybe I still do it well, although as I get older and as I have more responsibilities and less time, it's harder. When I was getting into game design, I learned a lot about 3D programming. I learned a lot about, how memory is handled and how to do resources. Then when I got into web design, I learned a lot about latency and how browsers worked and all the crap that we had to go through during the browser wars. Then there was getting into mobile, and then you had Web 2.0, and then you had different kinds of mobile as you moved to different handsets, and then you got into data, and now you're into like various forms, like how does content work, what can happen in 12 seconds of content. I mean, there's just all these places where we either don't have assumptions because it's new, or you do have assumptions and you need to check them because maybe they've been changed by what's there. There's a friend of mine, Jeff Parks, who does UX in Canada, and he had a really funny line saying, we know 10,000 hours might not be the perfect measure, but like, if it takes 10,000 hours to gain expertise, who the heck is an expert in social media, which has been around for maybe 1,000 hours at most? And I think that's that lifelong learning thing that you just can't get settled into something. Inherited opinion doesn't work. You just have to have those tools. And I think that's probably the most important thing. And that's also how you relate to people that are on your teams, how you manage up, and finding ways to do that. They can get very complicated and very thorny in some environments. So I think that's probably the biggest one.
It's really interesting when you think about lifelong learning, and you mentioned doctors or lawyers, and there's continuing education that they have to do. And I understand what they do is incredibly complex. But I feel like if you're a specific type of doctor, there is a specific type of thing you need to continue to learn about. And I would assume that's the same on the legal side of things. I feel like when you're in digital now, there are so many different shifts and so many different directions, where the one thing that I guess my thought on it is, when it comes to myself or even people on my team, I can't tell somebody, here's what you should be interested in. I think it's on you to figure out what you should be interested in and go out and figure out ways to learn about those things. So it's not like we don't have a narrow path. We have a very wide path.
That is a really good point, because I think, and that's part of the thing where I was talking about curiosity starts to become a skill. You can't tell them what they should be curious about, and they have to make choices about what to be curious about. I was doing a guest lecturer thing at a design place that did much more traditional stuff. And at one point, someone said, "Well, I'm in my last year. Do you think I should take textiles level 3, or should I try this?" And and it came off as kind of flippant. I had to come back. It's like, in some ways, the classes you take here don't matter, because fine, take either one of those. You're probably going to have to take the other at some point, but you're going to have to teach yourself how to do it, because you're not going to be here. So pick whichever one makes more sense, but challenge yourself. And then you also get into that Cal Newport thing. I think it was So Good They Can't Ignore You. And his very premise is, don't follow your bliss. You have to follow something that actually makes some sense, and then start to do some of that hard work. So I think you're right 100%. I'm not a prognosticator. I can't tell you what's going to be big, except for the fact that whatever you learn, you're going to have to learn something else after it. And that's the only thing that we know is going to be true in your career.
Yeah. One of the things that they talk about in our people and culture team with learning and development is this idea of 70-20-10. And so they say 70% of what you learn is by coming to work every day and doing your job. Then there's the 20%, which is through communication and collaborating with other people. Then 10% is self-learning, figuring out what you're interested in and doing those things. I feel like it's a huge 10%. I would probably readjust those numbers a little bit, because I don't think 10% is doing it enough justice. But I think being curious, and definitely a through line of curiosity here, but being curious and figuring out what are the things that I want to learn more about, which, by the way, is an incredibly difficult thing to do. But if you're able to do that in the long run, I feel like you'll be all the better for it. And it's never too late.
It's 100% true. And I think it's also true that we have to get better at describing what level of learning you need. I used to work with something like conversancy, or like when we say learn to code, it's worth, you take a 2-hour class and write a couple of programs. That will give you such cognitive empathy with the people that you have. You don't have to learn to code and write something. But I just want to come back to the thing on the 70-20-10, because I do think there is that 10% may be underselling what we need to do individually to sort of stay caught up. I mean, it's right that you need to adapt your skills and your style to your company, and you need to get the domain expertise inside whatever your company is in. But on the digital side of things, it's like there is a risk of, not spending enough time on that kind of stuff. I think I'm with you 100% on that one. That's really, and again, that highlights why it's a skill, because your curious perambulations around the web could help you be part of that learning process.
Thinking about what you're most excited about, you touched on this earlier, and kind of curious to learn more. And it sounds like there's a period of time where you just weren't that excited by the internet, and kind of curious what has happened and what you are looking forward to now.
Ryan, I was so depressed. The internet just let me down. It was so bad. Now there was that period where, in the early 2000s, there was always something new coming up, and it was great. And then it just seemed like there was this long period of like, no one's really doing anything new. And we're all sort of chasing very small problems, and as interesting as Instagram was when it got bought, it just wasn't that like explosion of things there. So part of what I'm having fun with now is there's this whole breakaway from Twitter or X, and some of these social media platforms. People are starting to go out and build the kind of internet that we had been promised or that we had hoped for. There's a little bit in that Cory Doctorow kind of place of like, the enshittification, if I'm allowed to swear on this, you can bleep that out, of the internet. And people are starting to rebuild that. And I'm finding that really interesting because we're going back to first behaviors, going back to like, at the beginning, Twitter was truly social. It was people talking to each other. And then it turned into a broadcast channel. And then it turned into, because it was a broadcast channel, it turned into something people wanted to manipulate. So I think I'm excited to see us rebuilding the social aspects of the internet. The other thing I'm really excited about, and this is like total nerd fest stuff, is we're starting to get a whole bunch of new tools. We talked about Figma, and I made a joke about this is the stuff that we were like dying to have, which would have made our lives easier. Now it's there in Figma, XD, Axure. And then you have like design tools like, I've got friends who are like, have canceled their Creative Cloud licenses and do everything in Canva. And I'm too old school to like let that go. It's like, no, I'm pretty sure I'm going to need the Bezier curves of Illustrator, but I'm not ready to make that shift yet. But that's really exciting, and that's even happening in like game design and 3D engines and some of those other pieces. And then the other one, and I'm actually doing this with a couple of startups, is the data tools that are out there, because we just don't have enough data tools for business users, and we're still using spreadsheets to try and develop insights about stuff. And this is totally nerdy. This is not the kind of stuff that would have excited a client at one of our future vision things. But I find it really exciting because it's just incredibly empowering, and it lets you bring people along with you. It lets you share files, and you can actually share files and do a fig jam and take your design file and say, okay, let's mark it up. What do you think is going on there, instead of the hand wavy stuff, or an email. So I'm really, really feeling that. I think that's kind of great. And I love that the price has come down for developing these tools, and that people can actually start to get back into reinventing the web in ways just beyond, becoming an influencer or something. I mean, people can actually do real work with these things. So I think that's great.
And I think a lot of what you just talked about, by the way, they got you excited again when you think about the iceberg analogy. I mean, I feel like a lot of that is core of the iceberg type of stuff, which is really interesting.
And it's nerd fun too. I mean, it's kind of funny because I was like, I'd been on like one of the coolest accounts of the internet. And when I talk to people today, it's like, what I really want to do? I want to solve enterprise software, because it's really interesting. I mean, it's not even remotely cool in 90% of the world, but there was a part it's like, yeah, that would be really fun to fix that. So yeah, there is a nerd outside to this answer.
Yeah, that's funny. And you're right. Well, 15 years ago, I don't think people were saying that.
Not many at all. Like, really, yeah, I want to fix a timesheets program because that will just liberate us. But it's true.
So I think that's a pretty good segue into the next one. What do you think the future of design looks like?
Yeah. So this one is, I've been thinking about this a little bit because we had talked about it. And I'm sort of even having some additional thoughts. One thing that I think is important, and I think we had talked about this some, with that idea about the stark necessity of glamour in design, that idea of storytelling. I think that has always been a part of being a design leader, to be able to tell a story. But I think it's also just becoming a more core skill. I'm not crazy about the word storytelling, because I think that lets people get a little bit too loose with like narrative and stuff. But I think there is something about digital communication and knowing how to do an infographic that you didn't just borrow from another deck, but to actually sort of say, what do I want to communicate? Can I do it visually? Can I do it with text? Can I do it with a chart that I created? And I think that's huge. And I think that brings together a lot of different kind of design and communication skills on top of the regular design that you do. And I think, and this was something that, we had talked about when we were talking about how do we cultivate junior talent. Like, okay, you're doing really well at sort of, knocking out the work that you're doing. Now you need to learn how to explain it to people. Now you need to learn how to sell it to people. Now you need to learn how to, and so I think that's a big part. The other one I think is getting back to this theme that we hit earlier, which is design now has, I just don't think, with the exception of pure visual design, I'm not sure there are any design disciplines that stay above the iceberg, where you can really safely sort of not understand the data model, not understand algorithm at some really basic level, and not understand how business processes are turned into digital processes in the back end. There's a creative director, it's really fun. I could tell this story for March Madness. You know how, like in offices, it's a very standard thing to do a bracket, right? And no one knows how to do a bracket. Like, I don't know Gonzaga versus Loyola. Like, what do you do? So this agency created a way to BS your way through a bracket. It's like you have to fill out a bracket, type in what you want to be able to talk about. We'll give you a credible bracket, and then when people give you grief about it, you can describe why. Well, I went with Gonzaga because they had a legacy. It could be, it's a hilarious idea, right? But it's actually really really smart. It serves a human need, and the reason I bring it up is that the creative director was a guy who was like writes hilarious 30 and 60-second TV spots, and one day he gets to work, and the developer has put a decision tree that lays out the algorithm. So we need your approval on this. And the guy's like, I guess this is my job now. And he was like, totally like, I make jokes. That's what I do. And so I think that's part of the thing that creativity needs to embrace code and data models in the same way that painters need to understand color theory or architects need to understand the materials. I think that's the thing that's now, I don't even know if it's controversial to say it anymore, but certainly 5 years ago, a lot of people would insist that that's not design or that's not the case. But I think that's happening, especially as interfaces get standardized. Now that we're on the phones, we have even less space to work in to be creative and less need to be creative with it. So the creativity and the innovation that we bring will, we have to reach deeper.
The bracket, that's brilliant.
I love that story. It just works at so many levels. I'm not a huge advertising guy, but it's just like that inside crack. It's like, oh God, I need that. I filled out so many pools. No, it's just like, take my $20.
Well, we all do, but for some reason it's fun. And on the digital communication storytelling piece, have you heard of somebody named Matthew Dicks, Dicks?
No.
You should check it out. I think he's wrote a few books, but he's wrote 2 on storytelling, and the last one he wrote is called Story Cell, which is incredibly, incredibly interesting. I think it hits on a lot of the points that you mentioned before. It's super fun to read or listen to, whatever your preference is, but definitely recommend.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Because this is one of my one of my holiday projects was to make sure that I was sort of understanding what people meant by that. And I needed a little bit more than the hero's journey or sitting around the campfire. I just wanted to get a little bit better about that, especially as I have teams that I still have to help with that or explain why I'm telling the story the way I am. So this is the guy who making stories come alive.
May have been. He did his I'm blanking on the name of his first book, which I also read. Storyworthy. His first book the first book was Storyworthy.
Okay, yep, that's it.
And then he followed it up with Story Cell, and I think it does a really good job of talking about bringing storytelling into the business context. Worse than just how do you tell a personal story that can make you more interesting. This does a great job of making it relevant for the type of stuff that we do. So.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for that.
I recommend. What are the most important takeaways from your career journey that you think everyone should know?
So I think I've hit this one enough, but it's just worth saying again, do lifelong learning and find ways to invest in it. Like I still spend, several $100s a year on my O'Reilly subscription. So I just have access to books that I can dig into things. I'm on Coursera and I'll just take classes to check things out, but it's getting interesting because now they expand to like cloud services and, it's just ways for refreshers. I think that's a good one. Storytelling we talked about. The other one I think I would throw in there is that I think the biggest thing that I have has been around, I mentioned a second ago, Cal Newport saying follow your bliss is terrible advice. And I think he makes a really compelling case for that, sometimes you have to adapt to what a market is going to pay for. But I do think there is a really important thing around finding the right corporate culture and recognizing that corporate cultures are going to be different and they may not offer you a job for corporate culture reasons. You shouldn't take it personally. And you may not want to accept a job or pursue a job because a corporate culture is different because you have a different temperament than what they actually want. And I think that's a really important one because there's not a single person out there who isn't going to say, if you ask them, do you want to be agile? They're going to say yes. No one wants to be clumsy. If you ask them if they want to be innovative, they're going to say yes. They don't want to be dull. But you need to interrogate what they really need and what they really want as they're trying to sell you, because even if they're a good company, even if they're good people, if your energy, going back to that firefighter creative idea, if they're hiring a creative person and you're a firefighter at heart or vice versa, it's not going to work. And that's a big one. And I think that's an important digital lesson because most companies are still figuring out what they are culturally when it comes to digital. Like, they'll know what they are in terms of their ongoing operations. But as they add in the digital stuff, you don't know what that is. You don't know if you're the ugly stepchild. You don't know if you can flow into the mainstream. So that was a really big one. Find the right corporate culture and then find the mode that works for you while still, not doing the follow your bliss thing. Like, don't be reckless about it, but recognize that there are matches like that and there are cognitive empathy matches that can keep you from succeeding. Because I think you and I have met, just probably know between us, hundreds of people, literally hundreds of people who have been like, yeah, they hired me to be a change agent. And then a year later, they're miserable because they didn't really want a change agent, or they didn't know what it meant, or there wasn't enough of a match up front. And I think that's still a challenge, even though we're almost 30 years into this digital revolution.
So moving into some closing questions, what is your favorite quote?
So I don't know how many people still know Tim O'Reilly. Like, I think back in the day, everyone knew the books with the animals on the cover, and then knew that that was O'Reilly Press. And they may have known that there was a guy, Tim O'Reilly, who had started it. And I think he started it during a recession when he was unemployed. So that there was an interesting lesson there. It's just like, hey, if you're not being hired right now, like, maybe think big and take a swing if you can afford to do it. But he has a great line, and I think he's really a worthwhile thinker because he's been around for all of it, but he's stayed pretty fresh and contemporary, but he also doesn't buy into the hype. But he has a great line, create more value than you take. And I think that's, as a solopreneur and as a consultant, and then also as a digital person who's trying to get people to see the value of the stuff that I can do, even if it's not obvious. I love that idea. And I think it's a nice moral take too. It's just like, constantly be trying to create value. Don't worry if you're monetizing it constantly, because eventually, you are going to be able to monetize it. And that's a good way to build long-term business. So I love that phrase, create more value than you take, is a big one for me. And then I have to say, I am using the phrase in shitification. Just I'm not sure how to do it a little bit more diplomatically, but that thing of like, there's so many races to the bottom that are happening in certain parts of the digital ecosystem that it's worth looking at. Like, are we building long-term value here, or are we just following a trend that's not going to really be lucrative for us? So that's a useful word.
Yeah, I think it is. Lots of good content out there. What are you looking at that you would want to recommend?
So I should say up front, I've put myself on a Mediterranean media diet. And so for people who don't know the Mediterranean diet, I know you're a health guy, so you probably know this, but the Mediterranean diet is the longevity and energy diet. And it's like lean proteins, lots of vegetables and whole grains, avoid the sugar highs. So that keeps me away from a lot of the hype cycle stuff and a lot of this is the next big thing. I used to call it the business week syndrome. There's a period of time when something crossed 1 million users, it showed up on the cover of Business Week and everyone lost their mind and we had to be doing it. And it just led to some really dumb efforts. So I'm a little bit off of that. So I do like things like Ars Technica, and there are some blogs that I follow, but my big thing is I spend a lot of my time on O'Reilly.com, just constantly reading new stuff and new series that they put together. It's an expensive subscription. I think it's like $400 a year, but you get access to all the textbooks, lots of classes, lots of lectures, and lots of talks. Coursera is another one. It's a cheaper one, but it's a way to stay on top of it. I use Bring Your Own Laptop, BYOL, just for those quick hits, because he's a friendly guy and it's a cheap way to just like, oh, okay, I got to find out what's up with Canvas, or they're going to use this tool. And then I do follow like the Cory Doctorow's of the world, and I'll still find like Wired's a little basic, but I'll still check in with that to find others to follow. But I really am keeping it lean and staying with like core skills And then I wait for like quarterly reports from something like The Economist or McKinsey to sort of catch more sober stuff so that I'm not constantly chasing headlines, because I just don't, back to that thing of like curiosity as a skill. I'm first of all, I'm older now, so I don't have that kind of time, but also we just need to like start to figure out like where we go deep rather than stay broad. So those are the places that I go. I hope that's useful, because those aren't terribly awe-inspiring ones like McKinsey's quarterly report for technology.
I mean, I love the Mediterranean diet technology, but yeah, I mean, I think that there was actually a lot of really good stuff there. And lastly, where can people find you?
Oh boy, this is bad. I'm just getting started on the Medium thing, and I'm adamantly off of Twitter, or X. So you can find me as Kipbot, Kipbot at Blue Sky, and I will be starting something called Code D in January, and it'll be just code -D or code/D on Medium, and so you can just find Kip Voytek and you'll find me under that one, and that's going to be starting in January. But I just found I was wasting way too much time on X or Twitter, and it was not producing what I needed. And then the other one is just Kip Voytek on LinkedIn, because that'll be a place where I'll be posting the stuff that I'm writing. But as part of the Mediterranean diet, I'm also trying to not engage with things that are less than 400 words. I feel like, we need more sentences and paragraphs to deal with the complexity of today, and 240 characters can be entertaining, but that's the sugar high that the Mediterranean diet, tells you not to take. So, so LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and eventually Code D in January. And actually, I'll send it to you if it starts before this releases to get the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely. And looking forward to Medium, seeing what you're up to there.
And I'll be hitting you up probably at some point, because I really like that piece you had about like the value of having come from an agency and people learning how to value the different skills that come from different environments, because there is a freedom and looseness of thought that we got from agencies that's still valuable if harnessed right. So that's a very useful one, insight you gave me. So I might come and hit you up for something.
Absolutely. Let me know. And thank you so much for your time today. I think there's a lot of great nuggets of wisdom here, and it's always good to see you.
Excellent. Great talking to you, and we'll reconnect when this is out.
That's it for today's episode. Let's keep the conversation going. Drop a comment with your thoughts, like this episode if it resonated with you, and share it with someone who might benefit. And don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Thanks for being part of this journey with us. Until next time.